Speaking of torture, the name dismemberment by horses is certainly familiar to many, but have you heard of tree ripping? It's a form of punishment used by the Russ people. They would tie a person's hands to two bent trees and then release the trees, allowing the force of the trees snapping back to instantly tear the person apart. Just like this. After fleeing Katagat, Ivar, along with his lieutenant and mercenaries, headed east along the Silk Road. Along the way, he encountered many exotic cultures he had never seen before. Here, people from different countries with different beliefs came to trade and perform, and there were all sorts of dazzling goods that left Ivar's eyes wide. Before long, they arrived in the eastern land of the Russ, where the observant Ivar noticed a one-eyed man following them. The next day, a group of Russ cavalrymen dressed in black clothes and hats charged at them, killing not only the merchants along the way but also proving too much for Ivar's mercenaries. It turned out these men were called by the one-eyed man, who had heard Ivar drunkenly claim he was a king, so he sold this information to the Russ soldiers. Curious about this so-called King Ivar, the soldiers took him back to Kiev. At this time, the ruler of Kiev was Prince Oleg the Prophet, whom everyone called Prince Oleg. Oleg was a man of cruel methods. Historical records indicate it was Oleg who moved the Rus capital from Novgorod to Kiev. Hearing that Ivar was a king from Norway, Oleg immediately became interested. His ancestors being Swedish Vikings who had established a centralized authority in Rus and had converted to Eastern Orthodoxy. Oleg had heard of the fame of Ivar the Boneless, but he was curious about Ivar's real intentions for coming. Upon learning Ivar was fleeing from his brother's assassination attempt, Oleg expressed his willingness to shelter him. Then, Oleg tortured Ivar's lieutenant, Vigrid, severely, wanting to understand the real purpose of Ivar's visit. Even though Vigrid confessed everything, the cautious Oleg still did not believe him. However, when Vigrid described Ivar as a god, Oleg realized Ivar held a significant place in the hearts of the Norwegians. Later, Oleg used an even more brutal punishment and invited Ivar to watch. They bent trees to the side and tied a man's hands to the bent trees. As the trees were released, the compressed trees snapped back in the opposite direction, tearing the man's body in half. Such cruel methods left Ivar gaping in horror, far more brutal than any burning or hanging punishment he had seen before. But Oleg's madness continued. He took Ivar on a hot air balloon ride, believing that if Ivar were a god, he would surely be able to fly and not fear heights. Unexpectedly, Oleg's words awakened Ivar. Ivar had almost forgotten he was a descendant of Odin, but then he became particularly calm and confident, even stating he would protect Oleg.
You're not a god!
Later, Oleg took Ivar to visit his late wife's mausoleum, as Oleg had personally killed his most beloved person because she and his lieutenant had an affair. This storyline made Ivar empathize, for he had also personally killed his most beloved, Fritis. After realizing they had much in common, a special relationship formed between them. Later, Oleg no longer pondered why Ivar had come to Russ, thinking it might be a sign. For years, their Rurikid kings had been looking east for trade, invasion, and expansion. With Ivar's arrival, Oleg considered it time to look westward. He wanted to use Ivar's abilities to invade the Scandinavian peninsula, to conquer his ancestors' homeland. Years ago, Oleg had hung his shield on the gates of Constantinople. Now, he wanted to hang it on the gates of Katagat. So, can Ivar seize this opportunity to turn the tables and take back Katagat? Let's wait and see.
Odin. To Odin.
Oleg took Ivar to the Rus capital of Novgorod, to meet his elder brother, Askold. Before the banquet began, Ivar was curious why everyone called Oleg the Prophet. Oleg explained that when he besieged Constantinople, the enemy's ruler invited him to dinner seeking peace. However, before that, he dreamt that someone had poisoned the wine, so he didn't drink a single drop at the banquet. But his lieutenant, ignoring the warning, drank the wine and indeed died of poisoning. Since then, he has been known as the Prophet. As Oleg finished his story, Askold entered the banquet hall with a boy. Askold was a favorite of King Rurik and, after Rurik's death, was in charge of guarding the heir to the Rus throne. This boy, Prince Igor. After a brief exchange, Oleg proposed the idea of invading Katagat to Askold. who was willing to support Oleg, but that wasn't the main point. As they raised their glasses to celebrate, Ivar noticed Oleg didn't drink his wine, and remembering Oleg's story about the prophecy, Ivar realized there must be something wrong with the wine. Then, sounds of battle came from outside.
Что не играете?
And soon after, the poison in Askold began to take effect. As the orchestrator of it all, Oleg instructed everyone to continue playing music and dancing. What was moments ago a brotherly exchange quickly turned into a scene of a murderer and his victim, with Askold suffering torturously like in hell, while Oleg reveled as if in heaven. As Oleg's guards stormed the hall, Askold succumbed to the poison and died. Oleg's move was to seize guardianship of Igor, as clearly, whoever controlled the country's lawful heir controlled the whole of Russ. Not long after, Oleg's second brother, Dir, arrived with his troops. Incredulous that his brother could commit such a cold-blooded act against their elder brother, Dir wanted to arrest Oleg for murder, though his real motive was also for Igor's guardianship. Dir gave Oleg 2 hours. If he handed over Igor, they would be spared. Knowing Igor's identity, Ivar also made efforts to get close to Igor, using small magic tricks to cheer up the boy. A boy just frightened was easily receptive to Ivar's kindness, so they quickly became friends. 2 hours later, Oleg still didn't bow to Dir's threat, telling him that if they weren't allowed to return to Kiev, Dir would meet misfortune in a few days. Because of Oleg's reputation as the prophet, people of that era believed in prophecies. However, Dir soon realized that maybe Oleg was just bluffing, wanting to test Oleg's power. Dir had recently secretly held a wedding, and only he and his wife knew of it, so if Oleg could name the bride, Dir would believe his prophecy. Unexpectedly, not only did Oleg know the bride was named Anna, but he also had her brought to the scene. Oleg's actions not only surprised Ivar but also scared Dir, forcing him to let them go. On the way back, Ivar was curious about how Oleg managed to do it. Oleg admitted he was just bluffing. Anna was his former lover, whom he grew tired of and then gave to Dir as a bride. Sadly, Dir was unaware. Back in Kiev, Ivar wanted to know when they would invade Katagat. Oleg said planning was needed, but before that, he had to deal with Dir, as Dir not only exposed his ambition but also threatened his safety. It doesn't take long for Oleg's soldiers to attack Dir's camp, and the dumbfounded Dir hasn't felt the murderous spirit behind him yet. They captured Dir and brought him to Kiev. Dir hoped for mercy for the sake of brotherhood and swore not to compete for guardianship again, but the cautious Oleg didn't believe him. Ivar and Igor's friendship grew by the day, with Ivar spending his days playing games with the boy and teaching him the Viking language. Later, Ivar and Igor heard the sound of ferocious dogs approaching. The scene they found was astonishing. Bjorn's first act as king was to judge those who had been Ivar's henchmen. They had committed many evils on Ivar's behalf, including burning Hvitserk's girlfriend, Thora, to death. To punish them for the crimes committed against their own people, Bjorn decided to banish them permanently and mark their faces so they could never escape their status as fugitives. Even if they were killed, no one would care. This white hair was the man who shot Magnus. You could tell from his expression that his desire for revenge was strong. As the saying goes, letting a tiger return to the mountain will lead to future problems. Who knows what white hair could stir up later? A few days later, a servant of Harald brought news. After being injured in the last battle, Harald was rescued by Olaf, who then took advantage of Harald's recovery to invade and take his kingdom. So, Harald sent for Bjorn's help, hoping Bjorn would remember their past camaraderie and help him out of this predicament. Without Harald's army, Bjorn couldn't retake Kattegat, and since Harald had once saved his life, it was only right for Bjorn to immediately send troops to assist. But now, Bjorn faced a greater responsibility. Katagat was undergoing significant changes, so he was torn about what decision to make. However, Hvitserk thought that whether it was Olaf or Harald, neither was as important as Ivar. As long as Ivar was alive, every one of them was in danger. Ub thought Hvitserk was traumatized by Ivar, so they didn't take Hvitserk's words seriously. Not long after, Kjetil returned to Katagat on Floki's ship, seeking to recruit settlers for Iceland. Kjetil told Ub about his experiences in Iceland, of course, omitting the part where he wiped out Ivan's family. When Ub asked about Floki, Kjetil lied, saying Floki had lost hope in their new life and disappeared without a trace. Clearly knowing Floki, Ub didn't believe Kjetil's words. Then Ub asked about a wanderer who had been to Iceland, having heard the man found a scenic and uninhabited land. Kjetil said the man's name was Other and that he now lived in Iceland. Ub was very interested in this land and wanted to go back to Iceland with Kjetil as soon as possible to meet Other, and of course, to find Floki. On the other hand, Lagertha decided to retire and, with the help of Ub and Torvi, rebuild her old farm. Bjorn came to ask his mother for advice on whether to rescue Harald. Lagertha said she didn't go to rescue Ragnar back then because no one is more important than the kingdom, but Bjorn said the kingdom could be left in Hvitserk's care. However, Hvitserk was now doing nothing but drowning in alcohol. How could a drunkard manage a kingdom? So, Bjorn could only ask Ub and Torvi to postpone their trip to Iceland and temporarily help him manage Katagat, because in the end, Bjorn decided to rescue Harald, otherwise his conscience would always be troubled.
We agree.
Before departing, Bjorn found Kjetil and expressed his skepticism about Kjetil's statements regarding Floki. Floki was nowhere to be found, alive or dead, which meant Kjetil was hiding something. So, he also asked Kjetil to postpone the Iceland trip and join his army. Bjorn wanted to hear more about Floki's story from Kjetil during this time. Not wanting to be suspected, Kjetil agreed to Bjorn's request. So, will Bjorn successfully rescue Harald? And will he be able to uncover Kjetil's crimes? See you in the next episode.
Come here, Bjorn. Don't deny the gods.
As the most charismatic Viking warrior, Bjorn has caught the eye of yet another woman.
I think I should be with you.
Why?
I know I'll bring you luck and good fortune.
Her name is Ingrid, a servant to Queen Gunhild. Ingrid tells Bjorn that she is a luck bringer to men. Her previous lovers have all prospered greatly, and now she can help Bjorn become the greatest king in history. Although Bjorn's heart belongs to another, Ingrid's attentions nearly cause him to falter. Before setting out, Ingrid seeks out Bjorn again, boldly slipping naked into his bed.
Come here, Bjorn. Don't deny the gods.
This time, Bjorn does not hold back. Meanwhile, Hvitserk is still tormenting himself for failing to kill Ivar and avenge Thora. To escape reality, Hvitserk drowns himself in alcohol and drugs, often hallucinating that Thora, burned to death, is haunting him. Thus, Hvitserk continues to numb himself with drinking and drugs, caught in a vicious cycle that leaves him in a dazed, nearly useless state. He saw not only Thora, but Ivar as well, and they seem to be hovering around him all the time. Poor Hvitserk is in immense pain. To this day, he has no children, as the women he's loved have all been killed by Ivar's hand.
He's over there.
On another front, Lagertha's farm is now established, and she suggests that Torvi leave her children with her. This would be more convenient for them, whether they're off exploring Iceland or helping Bjorn manage the kingdom. Torvi, of course, agrees to leave her children with the person she trusts most. Yet, this seemingly trivial matter lays the groundwork for Lagertha's eventual fate. One day, the outlaws of the deportation reached out to the old, the weak and the children in the neighborhood of the farm. They not only steal food and livestock but also violate them and even kill their young children. The women hope Lagertha will stand up for them. Knowing that the bandits will return, Lagertha, the most famous shield maiden, refuses to stand idly by, and she digs up the sword she had buried. Before long, Bjorn's troops reach the Vestfold Isles, and those two messenger servants also join them. Surprisingly, Bjorn openly shares his battle plans with them. Their strategy is to approach the city by water under the cover of night, but before they could swim ashore the two attendants fled, and they sensed that the smell in the water was wrong, and an eerie silence emanated from the bank. Clearly, these two were spies for Olaf. Once again, Bjorn falls into an enemy trap. Just as the troops are puzzled, a fierce fire blazes on the water, illuminating the warriors clearly. Bjorn immediately orders a retreat and urges everyone to dive into the water, but the enemy is already prepared. As the rocket is fired, flames also ignite behind them, forming a fiery ring on the sea. Above them, the enemy archers are ready, and at Olaf's command, They begin to shoot mercilessly. Bjorn's warriors, still unclear about what's happening, are killed in the fiery onslaught. Meanwhile, Olaf, still unsure, proudly sings of the twilight of the gods. Although they escape the encirclement, this defeat costs them many lives. So why is Olaf so brutal towards his former allies? And does he have a deeper plan in mind? The boy had just finished signaling to his companion when a sharp-eyed bandit shot him down with a bow and arrow from atop the hill. Another boy saw the signal fires and immediately blew his horn, prompting the villagers to grab their weapons. This was a defense mobilization organized by Lagertha to repel the attacking bandits. Everyone, from 70-year-old elders to 7-year-old children, was called to contribute to the defense. Unfortunately, both young sentinels could not escape unscathed. The bandits, mistaking the signal fires and horn for signs of the villagers fleeing, headed straight for the warehouse to begin their plunder. Little did they know, the villagers had not fled but were fully armed and ready for battle. As they began to break down the warehouse doors, archers perched on the cliffs struck first. The women and children, with newly made bows and arrows, launched volley after volley, suppressing the bandits with a barrage of fire. Caught off guard, the bandits were forced to rush into the warehouse to seek cover. Though not professionally trained warriors, the villagers fought fiercely to defend their families. The organized resistance of the villagers took the bandits by surprise. They had assumed they were facing defenseless, frail villagers and had made no battle plans. Moreover, Whitehair had not expected Lagertha to be involved, so he was forced to order a retreat.
Stop the attack! Get out! Get out now!
As the villains fled, Hallie emerged from the bushes, picked up a long sword, and mimicked the adults in celebrating the victory. However, Hallie failed to notice Whitehair, who had not gone far, recognizing him as Bjorn and Torvi's son, and seeking revenge for the scar Bjorn had left on his face. Whitehair charged at Hallie. Even though Lagertha sensed the danger, she was too late to stop Whitehair on horseback. After striking down Hallie, Whitehair rode off. Having avenged his exile by killing Bjorn's son, Lagertha was devastated by grief. She had volunteered to look after the child, only to have her grandson lose his life under her watch.
Hello, Lagertha.
In Katagat, Gunhild dreamt of a village burning, which she believed could be Lagertha's new home, but Ub was reluctant to mobilize forces based on a mere dream, as ruling the kingdom was a priority. Thus, the pregnant Gunhild set out herself to investigate, and by the time she arrived, Lagertha had already buried Hallie. Gunhild regretted arriving a step too late, and to fend off another invasion by the bandits, she stayed behind with a few shield maidens. They built additional fortifications, preparing to face the bandits' next assault. Meanwhile, Hvitserk continued to deteriorate. Ub thought Hvitserk's decadence stemmed from too much comfort, so he ordered him to lead a trade mission on the Silk Road.
I hope you agree to this, Hvitserk. Trying to help you.
I know.
But on the day of departure, Amma locked Hvitserk inside their house. Amma had always cared for Hvitserk and knew he was unfit to handle the mission in his current state. Seeing Hvitserk still in such a state of disrepair, Ub had no choice but to appoint another leader for the Silk Road. Ub was deeply disappointed in his brother, and this was the second time Hvitserk had let him down. But Hvitserk has no choice but to see Thora, who haunts him every day, on one side, and Ivar, who is a monster, on the other. He blamed himself for not avenging Thora by killing Ivar, yet he feared Ivar, having witnessed firsthand his brutal ruthlessness. Hvitserk's bloodshot eyes revealed his nearly sleepless state. Now, he was nothing but a useless addict. He even mortgaged his Viking arm ring to his boss in order to eat the mushrooms and malt horns that would make him happy. But what you can't imagine is that this piece of shit has done something that even Ivar couldn't do. So, what exactly did Hvitserk do that plunged all of Norway into profound grief? After his defeat in battle, Bjorn was invited by Olaf for negotiations. Olaf suggested they should stop trying to attack and look for another way to resolve their differences. As he wished to avoid further fratricidal conflict among their people, Olaf tells Bjorn to go back to his camp and give him an answer when he has a plan. Back at camp, Bjorn once again pressed Kjetil for the true version of the events in Iceland. This time, Kjetil finally told the truth, revealing the entire story of how he killed Eyvind and his family to Bjorn. Bjorn concluded that the shattering of his dream must have devastated Floki, and he saw Kjetil and Eyvind as the primary culprits. Bjorn even suspected Kjetil might have killed Floki, although he could not prove it at the moment. By revealing his thoughts prematurely, Bjorn's verbal warning not only failed to have any effect but also shook Kjetil's loyalty.
Each must die someday. Even you, Bjorn Ironside. Even you.
A few days later, Olaf thought of a way to prevent fratricide among their people by uniting all of Norway. Norway was fragmented, with continuous conflicts among royal families ruling their own territories. Olaf proposed that Bjorn, the great son of the Viking legend, become the king of Norway and their savior. He planned to gather all kings and lords for an election and was even willing to relinquish his own kingdom and power to support Bjorn.
So, go away and consider my plan. You are both free to do so.
After several days of consideration, Bjorn agreed to Olaf's proposal. Soon, leaders from all over gathered in Vestfold to meet the prospective King Bjorn. A leader named Thorkel asked if the so-called election was predetermined, and if it was a fair election. He too wanted to participate. Olaf clarified that it was not predetermined but a fair election. However, this was not Olaf's intention. He only wanted to go through the motions, aiming to ensure Bjorn's ascension to the throne while gaining general approval. But Olaf couldn't say this openly. However, don't forget that becoming the king of all Norway was Harald's lifelong ambition, and he would definitely support a fair election. Subsequently, Bjorn also stated that the election should be fair, as transparency and integrity were consistent with his character. With that, Olaf had no choice but to agree to this approach. This gave Harald a glimmer of hope, so he began to privately curry favor with the other leaders, even persuading Kjetil to join his campaign team. They constructed an election platform on the water, and the election saw 15 leaders casting votes with 4 candidates in the running: Bjorn, Harald, Thorkel and Hakon. The main competition was between Bjorn and Harald. Red runes represented Bjorn, and yellow runes represented Harald.
Today is an extraordinary and a unique day in the history and saga of our country. Never before have our rulers willingly gathered together to elect one of their numbers as King of Kings, King of all Norway, to cast the first vote. I vote for Bjorn Ironside as King of all Norway.
And I will also vote for Bjorn Ironside to be King of all Norway.
Olaf and Harald got off to a good start by casting their votes for Bjorn, followed by several of Bjorn's supporters also voting for him. Just as Bjorn led by 4 votes and seemed confident of victory, the unexpected began. Various unnamed leaders started their performances.
My vote goes to King Harald.
And mine to Earl Thorketin.
For Bjorn Ironside.
I cast my vote for King Harald.
And I also for King Harald.
Before long, Harald had narrowed the gap to just 2 votes, and the situation didn't end there. Several more leaders cast their votes for Harald. At this point, Bjorn's anger was visibly evident, and Olaf also realized that the situation was about to spiral out of control.
I cast my vote for King Harald!
It was Harald leading with 7 votes to Bjorn's 6, and the last voter, leader Thorkel, also cast his vote for Harald. Ultimately, Harald won the election by a margin of 2 votes, defeating Bjorn. So, can Bjorn accept this result? Find out in the next episode. This was the first ever election for a king in Norwegian history. They had to choose their king of Norway from 4 highly respected leaders. Originally, Bjorn was the designated choice for king, but a twist of fate turned the selection into a fair election. In the end, Harald narrowly defeated Bjorn by just 2 votes to become the first king after Norway's unification.
And so it has been fated. And who are we to question the wisdom of the gods? Harald, fine hair, you have been chosen to be the first king of all Norway.
This outcome surprised both Bjorn and Olaf. From planning to execution, Olaf paved the way for Bjorn, only to have their efforts inadvertently hand victory to Harald. Had they known, they would have killed Harald earlier. But now, with all dust settled, every Norwegian leader was a witness, and no one could dispute the results. Bjorn was the most upset, as he had gone to great lengths to save Harald, who would otherwise have remained a prisoner under Olaf. Yet now, Harald had transformed and become the king of all Norway. It wasn't Bjorn's dream to be king of Norway, but it was like having a duck in the mouth that flew away. There is nothing more cruel than giving someone hope only to plunge them into despair.
It was a fair fight!
Yet, Olaf was still puzzled about what promises Harald made to those people to sway the election.
I promised each of them what they wanted to hear.
Later, Harald thanked Kjetil but wanted to know why Kjetil had betrayed Bjorn. Actually, Kjetil was a very ambitious man, aiming to become the king of Iceland. Due to Floki's disappearance, Bjorn no longer trusted him, so Kjetil placed his hopes on Harald.
I want to be king of Iceland. And you can make it happen.
During their conversation, they realized Bjorn was not in the banquet hall. Later, Harald secretly sent out a few men, and Kjetil realized Bjorn might be in danger. Although Kjetil disliked Bjorn, not saving a dying man was not the Viking way, so he immediately went to warn Bjorn.
Bjorn, you have to leave. What do you mean? Harald is going to kill you.
But before Kjetil could finish his sentence, several armed warriors rushed in. Bjorn's fighting ability is diminishing day by day. Last time Harald saved him, this time it was Kjetil who rescued him. During the fight, Kjetil was struck in the thigh, leaving Bjorn to fight alone. Thinking he was about to die, Kjetil apologized to Bjorn, but Bjorn couldn't concern himself with that. Among those enemies were several whom he had marked. This was the consequence of letting the tiger return to the mountain. At that critical moment, a spear pierced an enemy's chest, and a red-haired warrior approached from the direction of the docks.
No time, he's too badly wounded.
With his help, Bjorn and Kjetil successfully escaped. Bjorn, who had come to rescue Harald with a large army, not only lost all his warriors but also handed Harald the throne of Norway, and now he was being hunted by Harald. The red-haired warrior was named Eric, who had been exiled for killing several neighbors and had become an outlaw.
For what it is worth, I offer you my protection.
It is very kind of you, but I noticed that you lost the election. So, I hope there is a future for both of us, Bjorn Ironside.
Come and fight me! I long for Valhalla!
After their previous invasion failed, the raiders launched another attack on the village, this time recruiting more men and devising a more detailed battle plan. For example, sending a raid on the archers at the high point. However, the villagers did not sit idly by. They constructed a labyrinth of vines on the road leading to the warehouse. In order to get the food, the robbers could not care less. They split into 3 groups and headed deeper into the labyrinth. But little did they know that this seemingly simple vine maze was filled with hidden traps. White Hair, frantic and furious, loudly called out for Lagertha, wanting her to appear and face him in a fight to the death, but this also revealed his position. Seizing the opportunity, Lagertha struck with her sword, but unfortunately, the blow did not hit White Hair's vital spot. Unable to break through the maze, the bandits had no choice but to scale the walls and flee. During the escape, the injured White Hair encountered Gunhild, who was unable to fight effectively due to her pregnancy. White Hair seized the opportunity and slashed at Gunhild's thigh, and a shield maiden who had come to help was beheaded by White Hair. At that moment, Lagertha also gave chase. Seeing this, White Hair did not dare to engage further. He had initially planned to draw the villagers into the clearing to fight, but found that his bandit crew had scattered in all directions.
And live like dogs! We may be skagamoors, but we can still reach Valhalla!
As White Hair shouted for his men, Lagertha also emerged. White Hair harbored his own grievances, believing that his loyalty to Ivar was not misguided. As he was loyal only to the king, he had wanted to continue serving Bjorn, but Bjorn never gave him the chance, instead stripping him of his pride and identity and branding him with an indelible mark. As the saying goes, a cornered dog will leap over a wall. As a fiery Viking, White Hair refused to die old in the forest. He was determined to take the most renowned shield maiden down with him if he was to die. Lagertha stated that Bjorn did not punish them for their loyalty to Ivar, but because they betrayed Ragnar's faith.
Everything Ragnar stood
And
for.
be prepared.
In the ensuing fight, both sides suffered injuries. The villagers in the maze also came to support, but Lagertha refused anyone's help. As the wife of a Viking legend, Queen of Kattegat, and Norway's most famous shield maiden, Lagertha is not afraid to die in battle. At that moment, Lagertha wanted to prove herself. She wanted everyone to see that despite her graying hair, despite her limp, despite her injuries, she remained the brave shield maiden. Even though her shield was shattered and her weapon knocked from her hand, Lagertha had no intention of seeking help. Lagertha spread her arms and fixed the enemy with a confident gaze, thinking that Lagertha had accepted her defeat. White Hair moved to finish her off, but Lagertha seized the opportunity to drive her broken shield into White Hair's neck. Then, Lagertha grabbed a long sword and ended White Hair, avenging her grandson Halli. Lagertha's counterattack was nothing short of spectacular, proving not only her bravery but also her extraordinary courage. Even Gunhild couldn't stop praising her.
If I didn't worship you before, Lagertha, I worship you now. May the gods in all their wisdom keep you alive.
In reality, Lagertha was just toughing it out during the fight. She had received a deep axe wound to her waist, which almost cost her life. But before Lagertha could rest for a few days, she had to return to Katagat to deliver a message. She needed to tell everyone what had happened here and apologize to Bjorn and Torvi. Gunhild wanted to accompany Lagertha back, but being pregnant and hindered in her movements, Lagertha declined her kind offer. On a stormy night, Lagertha returned to Katagat alone. The long journey, combined with her severe injuries, left her in a semi-conscious state. Meanwhile, the residents were all indoors avoiding the rain, and Ub and Torvi were quietly enjoying a performance in the longhouse. So, no one knew Lagertha had returned home. Unable to endure the excruciating pain from her torn wound, Lagertha finally collapsed off her horse and struggled to crawl toward the longhouse. At that moment, even a single person stepping outside could have been a lifesaver for her. Amidst her haze, Lagertha thought she saw the seer, who had already passed away, which reminded her of her own fate. Outside, the booming thunder sounded like Thor hammering his anvil, amplifying Hvitserk's fear, as he believed Ivar was coming back to settle scores with him. Despite Amma's repeated assurances that Ivar was not there, Hvitserk remained unconvinced.
You have to save.
How can I save when Ivar's coming to kill me? Huh? Do you want him to kill me?
No, of course I don't.
Then shut your mouth!
Tired of living in Ivar's shadow, Hvitserk decided it was time to end things, so he grabbed a dagger and rushed outside. At this moment, the singer is belting out a song inside the longhouse, although it's unclear what he's singing about. The tune is unmistakably tragic, as if narrating the final moments of a great leader. At this very place and time, this song becomes Lagertha's elegy, illuminated by flashes of lightning. Hvitserk spots a long tail. Approaching, he realizes it's what he perceives as the embodiment of Ivar. This time, Hvitserk will not back down. He musters the courage to charge at the monster and stabs it repeatedly with his dagger. However, when Hvitserk comes to his senses, he discovers that it's not a monster at all, but a struggling Lagertha.
It is what the seer foretold. That one day, I would be killed by a son of Ragnar.
Realizing the grave mistake he has made, Hvitserk can do nothing to undo it. He can only hold Lagertha and weep loudly in guilt.
I could not escape it, nor could you. Weep not, Hvitserk. Tonight, I'll sit with my beloved Ragnar in the halls of the gods. I lived a full life.
In this tragic mix-up, Hvitserk has killed Lagertha, Norway's most famous shield maiden. The Viking legend and wife of Ragnar, ultimately dies by the hand of Ragnar's son. Meanwhile, still adrift at sea, Bjorn senses his mother's demise.
What is it?
This episode of Vikings is the most meticulously crafted and the most sorrowful of the entire series. Vikings commemorates the legendary shield maiden Lagertha with a funeral of the highest standard. The story picks up right where the last episode left off. On a stormy night, Hvitserk inadvertently avenged his mother by killing the severely wounded queen of Katagat, Lagertha, and then fled the scene. It is only the next day that the townspeople discover Lagertha's frozen body. Seeing her revered queen meet such an end, Torvi is overwhelmed with grief. What baffles her even more is why Lagertha was alone at that place. Could Gunhild's dream have been true? Thus, Torvi immediately sets off for Lagertha's village. The astute Ob promptly suspects Hvitserk, but by this time, Hvitserk is nowhere to be found. Upon arriving at the village, Torvi naturally learns everything and can only accept the fact of her son's death with grief. They must return to Kattegat immediately to hold a grand funeral for Lagertha.
Lagertha must have a great funeral. She meant so much to so many.
As the Queen of Katagat, Lagertha cannot depart alone. Therefore, they need to choose one shield maiden from among many to accompany Lagertha to Valhalla. The shield maidens see this as the highest honor, and they all clamor to sacrifice themselves. Torvi also wishes to accompany Lagertha, but because she is pregnant, Gunhild refuses her request. They decide to let a raven, representing the gods, make the choice. After circling the hall a few times, the raven lands on a shield maiden named Gyda. Lagertha's deceased daughter was also named Gyda. This shield maiden's mother named her daughter Gyda in memory of Gyda who died from the plague, making her the most suitable person to accompany Lagertha. Not long after, Alma finds Hvitserk in the forest. Faced with questioning by Ob and others, Hvitserk remains silent, filled with guilt and fear, and now can only choose to flee.
I want to talk and just sleep.
Afterward, the sacrificial ceremony began, and Gyda, having been chosen by the gods, was eager to accompany Lagertha. Lagertha's heroic image appears repeatedly before her, and she feels Lagertha's call. Gyda first toasts the gods and Lagertha, then engages intimately with 3 young male priests representing the gods. After these events, what awaits Gyda is the Angel of Death. The Angel of Death offers Gyda 2 choices, a knife and a rope.
A knife.
Look at my eyes.
After the sacrificial ceremony, the funeral preparations are ready. As the Queen of Katagat, Lagertha's funeral is naturally a ship burial of the highest standard. Ob, Gunhild, and Torvi each offer their eulogies and gifts.
Farewell, Lagertha, Queen of Kattegat, Mother of Norway.
Just before the fire is lit, Lagertha's son Bjorn finally arrives.
You don't need to tell me, Oba. I already know.
As the character with the highest screen time throughout the series, Lagertha finally makes her exit in Season 6. Whether in the main storyline of Ragnar's era or the multiple subplots of the post-Ragnar era, Lagertha remains the soul of the series. Lagertha is not only the guardian of Katagat but also the staunchest supporter of Ragnar's faith. She is the greatest shield maiden of her time and a hero and role model to all women. Although Lagertha grew weary of fighting and longed to retire to a peaceful life, she ultimately could not escape her destiny. Yet Lagertha lived a truly remarkable life, helping Ragnar create the Viking legend and raising a great son who is revered by many. Countless heroes admire her, and both commoners and warriors regard Lagertha as a pillar of strength. Later, warriors on the cliffs help break the ice with arrows, and the shield maidens on the ice use their bodies to pull her boat. Lagertha's pale face becomes gradually blurred by the flames, but in people's hearts, she will always be the most charismatic queen.
In my dreams, we are always together.
After being captured by Oleg, Dir was treated like a dog and locked in a cage, his face bound with an iron chain. Ivar knew that with Oleg's brutal nature, it was only a matter of time before someone close to him would suffer, and this Dir might be an opportunity. During his time in Kiev, Ivar was constantly at Igor's side, trying to sow discord between Igor and Oleg. Essentially, he wanted Igor to understand that all of Russ should be under his rule, not Oleg's, and that he needed to find a way to break free from Oleg's control.
And everything in the whole of Rus, the land, the sky, the villages, the town, the people, it's all yours.
Later, Ivar secretly visited Dir and used the promise of freedom to test Dir's reaction. Hearing about freedom, a glimmer of hope ignited in Dir's desperate eyes. He expressed his willingness to exchange everything for his freedom, otherwise, he wouldn't survive the winter. Ivar was not interested in the lands, wealth, or beauty's Dir promise. He only wanted to use Dir to overthrow Oleg. One night, a naked woman caught the attention of the guards.
Don't just stand there gawping. Let's see what she's up to.
As the guards went forward to investigate, Ivar and Igor stealthily approached the cage holding Dir. While the dim-witted guards were still fantasizing about the naked woman, they were completely unaware that this was a diversion, and a cripple and a child managed to slip right under their noses. Indeed, the main reason was the naked woman, who was Dir's wife, Anna. They had already prepared to meet him outside the city.
This is not the last time I will Asperg. We shall meet again soon.
After discovering Dir's escape, Oleg killed those guards and presented their heads on the dinner table to test Ivar and Igor's reactions. Under Ivar's guidance, Igor did not show any flaws. Oleg issued a warning to Igor.
You understand that with Dear Free you are in more danger of being kidnapped than ever.
After that, the matter was dropped. But what Oleg announced next truly shocked Ivar. Oleg introduced his new wife, Princess Kattegat, to them. Upon closer inspection, Ivar was stunned. She looked almost exactly like Fritis. Even Igor noticed Ivar's astonished expression, and he even suspected Ivar of seeing ghosts.
Believe me, I have.
Ivar believed that Oleg was taunting him after investigating his background, so he privately approached Kattegat to get some answers.
You are Fritis.
Freydis, I don't understand.
Neither do I. But it is true, and you and I were once married.
However, Kattegat showed no reaction to Ivar's story and instead questioned him.
What happened to us?
Unable to admit that he had personally killed Fritis, Ivar could only guiltily watch Kattegat walk away. Upon learning that his new wife resembled Ivar's former wife, Oleg's mischievous nature was rekindled. To embarrass Ivar, they deliberately asked Ivar to help Kattegat remove her coat, and even began a live show in front of Ivar. Ivar could hardly stand to watch this, but Oleg wouldn't let him leave and told him it was for his own good. This undoubtedly pierced the most vulnerable part of Ivar's heart. Throughout the entire winter, they stayed in Kiev, waiting for spring to arrive. During this time, Igor fulfilled his wish to ice skate, and Kattegat fulfilled her desire to soak in a hot spring. Compared to the wishes of women and children, the desires of Ivar and Oleg could never be fulfilled, because one wanted to walk like a normal person, and the other wanted to return to his mother's womb to be reborn. Perhaps only those who dare to dream and act are qualified to achieve great things.
It's only the beginning.
It's only the beginning!
Once again, a scene of fratricide unfolds before us. Bjorn is set to execute his half-brother Hvitserk by fire. The reason for this drastic action is that Hvitserk murdered his mother, the Queen of Katagat, Lagertha. Although Hvitserk killed Lagertha in a state of delirium, he had avenged his mother's death, so he harbored no regrets. Just as the flames were about to consume Hvitserk, Bjorn gave up a knowing look. The merciful Bjorn spared Hvitserk's life. After all, killing his kin was not in keeping with Ragnar's beliefs, as Ragnar had once spared Floki's life. Though spared from death, Hvitserk could not escape punishment, and Bjorn was not about to let him ascend to Valhalla so easily. Bjorn banished Hvitserk from Katagat, letting him experience the life of a fugitive. Whether Hvitserk would survive the winter was now up to fate. For some time afterwards, Bjorn fools around with Ingrid on a daily basis, and Gunhild, with her womanly instincts, soon puts the lie to their adulterous affair. Surprisingly, Gunhild did not explode with rage. She realized that Bjorn had fallen in love with Ingrid. Moreover, Gunhild was grateful to Ingrid for helping Bjorn heal from his grief, especially since Bjorn had just lost his mother, his child, and the throne of Norway. Considering the greater good, Gunhild released Ingrid from her servitude and allowed Bjorn to take another wife.
But you should know, Bjorn, your mother was attacked by the outlaws you released from Kattegat. You are a great man, but even great men make mistakes.
A few days later, Ab and Kjetil set off on their journey to Iceland. Before departing, Ab and Bjorn embraced tightly. Little did they know, this farewell would be their last. In a Norwegian village, the Russ began their probing attacks. They started by planting a military flag on the open ground, followed by ghost-like cavalry. As the saying goes, true talent is found among the common folk, and who would have thought that a Norwegian blacksmith would possess such extraordinary combat skills? With a hammer in his left hand and a horseshoe in his right, he taught these Russ, who bullied the common folk, a severe lesson. However, aside from the blacksmith, the other villagers had no ability to fight back. They were like fish on a chopping board, at the mercy of their enemies. The blacksmith continued to fight valiantly, but even the biggest tiger could not stand up to a pack of wolves. Isolated, he could not withstand the successive attacks of the Russians, and eventually he was cut down from behind by the enemy. With the blacksmith's death, the massacre finally came to an end. After the Russ departed, an elderly survivor was rescued and brought back to the capital.
And what does this signify? What did these raiders look like?
Strange men with strange voices. Went like ghosts.
Yet, when the old man described the enemy, the arrogant herald scoffed at his account, asking Olaf for his opinion on the matter.
Who have staked a claim to our land. And one day, they will return. Not as a raiding party, but as an army.
As the predecessor to Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, the ancient state of Russ was also a formidable power. Its leader, Prince Oleg, once hung his shield on the walls of Constantinople as a declaration of his conquest of that place. If you're skeptical, these well-trained Russ troops will prove it. Near Kattegat, Eric's patrol clashed fiercely with a Russ assault team. After a brief encounter, realizing victory was out of reach, Eric was forced to order a retreat. The Russ, however, merely made a probing attack and did not pursue their enemies. Coincidentally, the commander of this Russ assault team was Ivar, who happened to encounter the exiled Hvitserk. Fate brought the two brothers back together. Ivar was puzzled by Hvitserk's plight, and Hvitserk felt awkward, never imagining that his rescuer at his lowest point would be Ivar, whom he had long sought to kill. On the return voyage, Hvitserk slept soundly against Ivar, as if his fear of Ivar had transformed into dependence. Ivar, too, was conflicted, unsure why only Hvitserk had such a deep bond with him. Despite their on and off relationship, they eventually reunited. Yet Hvitserk's return still brought Ivar genuine joy. On the other side, a subordinate who had traveled the Silk Road informed Bjorn that those were the Russ people who had sheltered Ivar. The legendary vastness of the Russ lands, their abundant resources, and strong populace, now augmented by Ivar's cunning, were deemed too formidable to resist. Thus, Gunhild suggested seeking peace with Harald, hoping that an alliance might offer a sliver of hope. Although Bjorn harbored deep hatred for Harald, he acknowledged the wisdom in the proposal and sent Erik as an envoy to broker peace. Since Harald became king of Norway, he has become more and more arrogant, and after he recognizes Erik as an outlaw, he doesn't give him a chance to speak. Moreover, Erik was a subordinate of Bjorn, whom he most envied.
I know you for a Skogamar. An outlaw!
Yet, Olaf kept persuading Harald, convinced that Erik must have urgent intelligence, otherwise, he wouldn't risk his life to deliver the message. Harald keeps Olaf with him because he knows he has a different kind of intelligence, so Harald agrees to give Erik a chance to talk. After persistent and patient persuasion, Harald finally agreed to ally with Bjorn, on the condition they jointly defend the capital. Meanwhile, Ivar brought Hvitserk back to Kiev. After learning that his mother's murder had been avenged, Ivar finally fulfilled a long-held desire. Later, Oleg held a military parade outside Kiev to show Ivar and Hvitserk his true strength. Witnessing the disciplined ranks below, Ivar was astonished. He had never seen such a vast, regular army. No matter how highly regarded Harald and Bjorn were, they could not withstand such a force. Ivar was summoned to the hall by a maid. As the curtains slowly parted, a vision of an angelic woman unfolded before him, leaving Ivar utterly transfixed. Clearly, Kattegat was deliberately trying to please Ivar. Having heard his ex-wife was blonde, she donned a golden wig for the occasion. Ivar's emotions were a complex mix of longing and guilt towards Fritis, but he had no desire to become involved with Kattegat. Faced with Kattegat's advances, Ivar could only mention his own imperfections.
You know I can't.
Of course you can.
Unexpectedly, Kattegat's words echoed those of Fritis, yet Ivar no longer wanted to live in the shadow of his ex-wife's memory. Ivar removed Kattegat's wig and thanked her with a passionate kiss for her efforts. Nevertheless, Ivar helped Kattegat put on her coat and declined her advances. A few days later, Kattegat explains to Ivar why, that she made a pass at him because she's on Prince Dir's side too. Since Ivar had saved Dir's life, she wanted to show her gratitude in this manner, but the cautious Ivar doesn't make any statement. After all, Kattegat is Oleg's wife. Ivar knew Oleg was watching their every move.
I think I'm falling in love with you. And I don't even know who you are.
Meanwhile, Bjorn had arrived in Vestfold and, after assessing the enemy situation, they immediately formulated a defensive strategy. Essentially, the strategy involved setting up defenses along the coastline. The problem was that Bjorn didn't know where Ivar would land, so they had to include every possible landing beach in their defenses. It was a massive undertaking, and nearly everyone was involved. During this process, Harald took a liking to Ingrid. As a king, Harald was not short of women, but he had a penchant for taking what belonged to Bjorn. Harald is not only jealous of Bjorn, but he is also displeased with Bjorn's achievements, which he believes are due to his father being Ragnar.
We have just met, and already you want me to betray my husband.
The best fruit is always forbidden.
At the same time, the pregnant Gunhild was also working on the docks. Erik admired Gunhild for her generosity and capabilities, continuously making advances toward her. Erik suggested Gunhild rest to preserve her pregnancy, but the strong-willed Gunhild did not want to be seen as weak. Erik, in his efforts to please, stayed close to Gunhild. However, the strenuous work caused Gunhild distress, leading to a miscarriage. Gunhild felt she had let Bjorn down since he now had no sons. Hoping Ingrid could soon bear a son for him, their conversation was overheard by Harald, who was eavesdropping outside the door. Yet this wasn't the focus. What mattered was that Ingrid, after spotting Harald, deliberately provoked him with her words.
You are the true king of Norway.
Ingrid's statement clearly implied that Harold was inferior to Bjorn. What Harold could not stand most was being looked down upon by women. He couldn't understand why Bjorn seemed to have everything and why the women preferred Bjorn over him. Thus, Harold finally unleashed his fury. Before Ingrid could inform Bjorn, the Russ fleet arrived. The invading force was estimated to consist of several hundred warships and tens of thousands of soldiers. Only Thorkel the chief had answered Harold's call. Will the Vikings be able to withstand the Russ invasion? And will other chiefs come to their aid?
We will meet again, husband.
This is the Kiev and Russ version of D-Day, and for Norway, it's akin to the twilight of the gods. Prince Oleg of Kiev is set to lead tens of thousands of soldiers in an invasion of Norway, ruled by Harold. In this battle, Ivar will confront his brother Bjorn, making it yet another conflict among kin. Before the battle began, the brothers engaged in a heartfelt dialogue. Ivar remarked that the gods relish seeing them fight, so they obliged. Bjorn accused Ivar of betraying their father's faith by bringing Christians to fight their own people. Ivar firmly believed that their father took him to England because he saw him as the heir. However, Bjorn countered by saying that Ivar was their father's last choice only because everyone else had rejected him. Though this was the truth, it also proved that all the other sons had abandoned their father except for Ivar. Ivar believed that he alone truly carried on their father's legacy, and the bond between him and their father was unmatched. If Bjorn is not convinced, then he will have to prove it with victory.
And you are wrong, Ivar. And I'll prove it.
The battle then commenced, with the first wave of Russ soldiers storming the beach. Compared to Viking longships, the Russ warships were clearly more advanced, capable of transporting not just numerous soldiers but even horses. The Russ cavalry used grappling hooks to pull away the Vikings' defensive barriers, effectively tearing open a breach in their lines. Once a gap appeared in the thin defensive line, the enemy surged in like a tide. From the scene, it is evident that the Vikings have extended their defensive line quite long, and such a setup requires a significant number of warriors. Due to the lack of manpower, their defenses were only long but not thick. As more Russ troops landed, the Vikings' first line of defense was nearly overwhelmed. On another front, Ivar and Oleg led another fleet to attack from the river. Gunhild, commanding the river defenses, ordered the Vikings to ignite obstacles on the river. However, this was futile as the Russ soldiers easily jumped onto the pontoons. While fending off the Viking soldiers, the Russ sought opportunities to cut the ropes holding the barriers. Soon, they severed the ropes, and the Russ warships broke through the defenses. Seeing the defenses about to fall, Gunhild charged onto Oleg's flagship, followed closely by her warriors, attempting to strike at the enemy's command center. As the saying goes, capture the king to defeat the enemy. Gunhild's tactic was sound, but she overlooked one fact: the flagship was filled with elite fighters. Oleg, his lieutenants, and Ivar Hvitserk were all on board. Although Gunhild was valiant, she was no match for Oleg. Oleg knocked Gunhild's weapon away and wounded her thigh, while Ivar was poised to throw a dagger at her from above. To save her life, Gunhild had no choice but to jump overboard and flee. Thus, the Russ easily breached the river defenses. Bjorn had not stationed many troops here because the river led only to the back of the town, bordered by impassable cliffs. So, it was understandable not to allocate many forces near this natural barrier. However, Ivar always managed to exploit the enemy's psychology, anticipating that this spot would be lightly defended. Thus he aimed to make the impossible possible. His plan was to scale the mountain and catch the Vikings off guard from behind. Finally, the beach's first line of defense could no longer hold because Harold had failed to fulfill the promises he made to other chiefs to win the election. Therefore, Harold's call went unanswered, leaving them significantly outnumbered by the enemy. Will the second line of defense be able to hold off the invading Russ? Find out in our next episode. This is the latter half of the battle for Norway. Since the new Norwegian king Harald didn't keep his word, his call was not answered by the chiefs, their forces greatly outnumbered by the enemy. The first line of defense was quickly breached. Eric, the commander at the second line of defense, took advantage of their high ground to launch multiple volleys of arrows at the enemy. They deployed a mechanism resembling spiked balls, which the Vikings then set aflame. However, no matter what contraptions the Vikings used, they only momentarily hindered the Russ. The overwhelming numbers of the Russ proved to be their greatest advantage, making the fall of the Vikings' second line of defense inevitable. During the battle, Chieftain Thorkel, the only leader truly supportive of Harold and who responded to his call, was the first to fall. This implies that if Harold had not relied on false promises during his election campaign, the throne of Norway should rightfully have belonged to Bjorn. Had Bjorn been king, his prestige would have quickly rallied the chieftains to his aid, potentially averting this disastrous battle. Seeing his own forces dwindling and the Russ continuing to land in relentless waves, Harold realized the situation was hopeless. With no chance to retreat, enemy forces relentlessly pressed on, severely wounding him. Harold collapsed on the beach to await his final fate. Meanwhile, Bjorn continued to lead his warriors in a fierce struggle, barely holding the second line before rushing to reinforce the front. Bjorn recalled his conversation with Ivar, knowing he had made countless mistakes, but determined not to fail this time. Yet, Ivar believed that the gods had abandoned Bjorn long ago, making victory impossible for him. Indeed, as Bjorn returned to the front, the endless sight of Russ warships and soldiers only deepened his despair. At the same time, the Russ soldiers scaling the cliffs appeared behind them, signaling that Ivar's forces had also joined the battlefield. Though Eric was a skilled fighter, the overwhelming enemy numbers meant he could only order a retreat. As Harold lay gasping for breath, he urgently told Eric that escaping was crucial. Without a moment to spare, Eric picked up the crown from the ground and swiftly fled the battlefield. But Bjorn remained on the front lines, fighting desperately with a do-or-die resolve, aiming to prove himself the true heir to Ragnar's legacy. However, just as Bjorn felled an enemy, Ivar followed through by thrusting his sword through Bjorn's chest. With the fall of Harold and Bjorn, the battle concluded with a victory for the Russ.
The gods abandoned you a long time ago, my brother. There's no way you can win. Believe me. No way you can win.
So ended Bjorn, known as Ironbone? And did the severely injured Harold also perish there? Prince Oleg of Kiev led thousands of elite troops to capture the Norwegian capital of Seafoll. Meanwhile, Norway's spiritual leader, Bjorn, was stabbed by Ivar, but luckily, he did not die from his wounds. His men carried the unconscious Bjorn back to Katagat. Although the Russ achieved a great victory, their casualties exceeded expectations. The bravery of the Vikings surprised Oleg, who wondered if Bjorn was truly dead. Hvitserk claimed that no one could kill Bjorn, known as Ironbone, as he had seen Bjorn being carried off the battlefield. Thus, he was sure Bjorn had not fallen in battle. They brought forward 2 prisoners. One was the severely wounded Harold, and the other was Olaf. After some consideration, Oleg decided to spare Harold's life but unfortunately decided to execute the now useless Olaf. Before his execution, Olaf heard someone speaking next to him, but no one else saw or heard this person. Everyone thought Olaf was hallucinating, but he recited content from the Bible. Clearly, the Vikings would not know the Bible, so Oleg had to believe that a saint was protecting Olaf. In order to train Igor, Oleg tells him to burn Olaf, and after much hesitation, Igor does so. Afterward, Olaf clasped his hands together and did nothing, allowing the flames to devour his body. This eerie spectacle severely disturbed Oleg, who hadn't expected such a powerful spiritual presence from a heathen, and he quickly fled the scene. When Ivar went to find Harold, the cell was empty. He thought Harold had escaped. However, the reason Oleg spared Harold was that he had other uses for him. The scene cuts back to Katagat. Bjorn remained in a coma due to his severe injuries, with his 2 wives constantly at his side. During this time, Ingrid confessed to Gunhild that Harold had raped her. Gunhild intended to avenge her, but she had to stay by Bjorn's side. If Bjorn were to die, she would join him in death. Ingrid lamented, thinking she could bring good fortune to Bjorn, but it all turned into a disaster. A few days later, Chief Håkon, summoned by Bjorn, arrived. Since Bjorn's summon came after Harold's, by the time Håkon received it, the Russ had already claimed victory.
I was summoned in the name of Bjorn Ironside. And when you're summoned by son of Ragnar Lothbrok, then you come.
By then, Bjorn had awakened. Knowing that the Russ would soon attack Kattegat, he prepared for another battle.
We need you. We need you to live, to lead us. Your name alone is worth 100 warriors. No, 1,000 warriors.
Soon, scouts spotted the Russ army moving towards Katagat by land. Eric believed that even with Håkon's support, they were still outnumbered. The most crucial issue was that Bjorn could not fight, which would significantly lower their morale. Thus, Eric suggested delaying the battle to wait for more chieftain support. Although Eric was correct, this still angered Bjorn. As a descendant of Odin, he would never allow Christians to trample his people unchecked. Bjorn became so impassioned that he even coughed up blood.
You are no true believer. Why don't you just walk out of the gate? Surrender. Is that what we have come to? Is that how our world will end?
Eric felt ashamed after hearing Bjorn's words and sincerely apologized to him. He admitted he did not have Bjorn's vision and acknowledged that no one in Norway could replace Bjorn. Eric placed the crown on Bjorn's bed, marking him as the true king of Norway from that moment. Bjorn understood Eric's analysis made sense. At that moment, he cared not for crowns but only wished to save his people from the Russ cruelty. Thus, Bjorn devised a strategy to address this national crisis. What was Bjorn's strategy, and what would his fate be? This is the personal finale for Bjorn Ironbone, son of the legendary Viking, Ragnar. In my opinion, Bjorn's curtain call is the most heart-stopping and gut-wrenching moment of the entire series. On the eve of the great battle, Chief Håkon ventured alone into the Russ camp to announce Bjorn's death and to offer his surrender to Oleg.
Yes, I saw the body with my own eyes. His wives are lamenting over it. There's great sorrow in Katagat.
However, Oleg did not accept Håkon's surrender. After killing Håkon, Oleg sent messengers throughout the camp to spread the news of the spiritual leader of Norway's death, hoping to boost his soldiers' morale. Katagat seemed within easy reach. The next day, as the Grand Army prepared to attack Katagat, a familiar figure appeared on a distant hillside. Bjorn, alone on a white horse, casually made his way toward the battlefield. All the Russ soldiers knew of Bjorn's supposed death, yet here he was, very much alive before them. Given the superstitions of the time, this sight filled the soldiers with extraordinary fear. To test whether Bjorn was man or ghost, Ganbader drew his bow and shot arrows at him. After Bjorn had been hit by several arrows and was spitting blood, Ganbader proudly told everyone that the so-called Iron Bone was nothing more than that. But Bjorn's next action terrified the Russ soldiers even more. Despite his injuries, he slowly raised his king's sword.
It's impossible.
I told you, Ivar, you can't kill him.
He's not a god.
Neither are you.
As Bjorn lifts the king's sword above his head, Vikings emerged from all around to stand behind King Bjorn. Men, women, elderly, and children, all warriors for Bjorn. They were ready to fight for their homeland. They were ready to fight for their great king. Then Bjorn points the king's sword towards the distant horizon, and more Viking warriors appear behind the Russ. The chieftains who had heeded Bjorn's call finally arrived. They had come to save their nation. In their hearts, Bjorn was the true king of Norway, the only one who could unite the Norwegian people. Then the Vikings charged. By then, the Russ, already terrified by Bjorn's seeming immortality, lacked the courage to face a man who could not be killed, who perhaps was now a god in their eyes. Most of the Russ commanders fled the battlefield without fighting. Tragically, Amma, who adored Hvitserk, was the first to fall.
Farewell, my brother. It gladdens me to know that Odin makes ready the benches for a feast. Soon, you will be drinking ale from curved horns. The Valkyrie summon you home.
Ultimately, Bjorn's great sacrifice secured Norway's safety. His self-sacrifice was a stroke of genius, inspiring his people and daunting his foes. With this, after the departures of Ragnar and Lagertha, the show's third soulful character makes a tragic exit. From the first episode, we have watched Bjorn grow, much like parents watching their child. From receiving the title Ironbone from Ragnar to completing the harsh winter trials, from his journeys across the Mediterranean to his campaigns in England, from being king of Katagat to being king of all Norway. Although Bjorn lacked Ivar's cunning intellect, these minor flaws did not diminish his greatness. He was fiercely brave, generous, loyal, and awe-inspiring. His deeds are too numerous to be summed up briefly. While this is not the true end of the historical Bjorn, no one's sacrifice is more valuable in this series. Bjorn alone united all of Norway, using his last breath to repel the invaders. After Bjorn's death, Gunhild built an eternal mausoleum for her revered husband, commemorating his contributions to Norway. Farewell, great Bjorn, farewell, the true warrior in our hearts. Can you believe it? A man born without male function, crippled from birth, miraculously regained his virility with the help of a woman who closely resembled his ex-wife. Had he known it was this simple, he wouldn't have endured such ridicule in the first place. The first thing Oleg did after returning home from his defeat was to destroy Igor's fairy tale cottage. He wanted Igor to understand the harsh realities of the world before he could trust him to take over the kingdom.
Sam, you grew up, Igor. You're not a child anymore. Your age of innocence is over, gone. I will no longer protect or shield you from the harsh realities of life.
His second act was to execute the officers who led the retreat. Had they not shown cowardice at the critical moment, the battle might not have been lost. In the end, Oleg left 2 officers behind. Just as he had previously executed Olaf to toughen Igor's mind, Oleg forced Igor to personally kill these officers. Despite his reluctance, Igor, driven by fear of Oleg, had no choice but to comply. When Ivar asked Igor how he felt, Igor confessed to feeling terrible, even suicidal. At that moment, a beggar called out to them. Approaching, they realized the beggar was none other than Prince Dir. Dir revealed that the returning warriors were dissatisfied with Oleg, making it the perfect time to overthrow him. They agree that when Ivar receives a dagger, that's when he'll take Igor away from Kiev.
You are the rightful king of this great land. I will see you crowned.
Thank you, Prince dear. I love you.
Meanwhile, Oleg was busy sowing discord between Hvitserk and Ivar. He badmouthed Ivar, claiming he would never have waged such a pointless war in impoverished Scandinavia if not for Ivar. He shifted his focus back to Constantinople, hoping Hvitserk would serve as his captain of the guard in the upcoming campaign. Oleg also tempted Hvitserk with women and opium. Initially wary, Hvitserk, who had achieved little, was eager for a chance to prove himself in Constantinople. Seeing Oleg's enjoyment while smoking opium, Hvitserk eventually succumbed to the temptation.
Smell it.
When Ivar found Hvitserk again, he had become a heavy smoker. Looking at Hvitserk's bewildered eyes, Ivar knew that this brother already belonged to Oleg. Later, Kattegat approached Ivar again, dressing as a Viking to please him. It was clear she truly liked Ivar, otherwise, she wouldn't have gone to such lengths to mimic another woman. Though Ivar resisted, Kattegat initiated intimacy, eventually restoring Ivar's manhood through her skills. It seemed Ivar was finally going to have his own biological child. During this time, Oleg grew closer to Hvitserk while deliberately alienating Ivar, even excluding him from meetings. This led to a fierce argument between the brothers. Ivar wanted to know why Hvitserk's loyalty to Oleg surpassed that to his own brother. Hvitserk felt valued by Oleg, unlike how Ivar had treated him, like a dog to be called and dismissed at will. Moreover, Oleg was poised to rule Constantinople and, potentially, the future world.
Dad, poor Ivar! You're just a cripple. I'll kill you! Fight me!
Oleg's scheme had succeeded. He aimed to turn Hvitserk and Ivar against each other, thereby reducing any threats close to him. Hvitserk took this opportunity to vent his long-standing resentments towards Ivar. For years, Hvitserk had lived in the shadow of Ivar, and now he finally unleashed his pent-up emotions. Ivar was beaten until he spat blood for the first time. Seeing a disabled person beaten like this, one wonders if anyone felt a shred of pity for him. Before long, Oleg summoned Ivar alone, this time to speak ill of Hvitserk. Oleg considered Hvitserk rash and unfriendly, and he apologized for his cold treatment of Ivar, offering to kill Hvitserk right then if Ivar wished. But Oleg's schemes were child's play to Ivar, who tactfully declined.
If anyone kills him, it should be me.
A few days later, Kattegat presented Ivar with a dagger, the agreed-upon signal with Dir for their escape from Kiev. It was time to act. Ivar didn't want to abandon Hvitserk, so he informed him about Oleg's plot to sow discord between them and his plan to kill Hvitserk.
I could have said yes.
Perhaps you should have.
I would have never said yes.
Hvitserk was surprised that Ivar, who had been so ruthless before, had become so loyal and honorable. In the past, Ivar would have done everything to eliminate him. Now, not only was Ivar not seeking revenge, but he was also thwarting Oleg's schemes. As a result, Hvitserk changed his attitude and agreed to help Ivar and Igor flee Kiev. During a conversation with Oleg, he learned that an Easter celebration was planned in a few days, with Bishop Leon coming to preside over the ceremonies in Kiev. That day would be their best opportunity. Indeed, on the eve of Easter, all the faithful gathered at the gates to welcome Bishop Leon. Taking advantage of the empty city, the brothers killed a groom and his apprentice and disguised themselves in their clothes. Kattegat, too, was ready to flee with Igor and Ivar. Before long, a man covered in blood and wearing a crown of thorns appeared in the distance. He walked with heavy, labored steps, carrying a massive cross on his shoulders. Behind Leon, his attendants were reciting the Bible and beating their backs with leather whips. In this ascetic way, they wanted to experience the suffering of Jesus.
Brothers in Christ, remember this day, the day of our dear Lord's crucifixion. Kneel and pray.
But while they were praying, Oleg realized that something was wrong, because Igor was not here.
Where's Prince Igor?
Meanwhile, Ivar, disguised as a groom, was exposed. With no other choice, they had to kill the guards. Luckily, there weren't many people in the city, so they hid the body and quickly passed through the inner gate. But there's only one way out of the main city of Kiev, and that's through the gate in front of the church. At that moment, Bishop Leon and the congregation were gathered at the church entrance. As the ruler of Kiev, Oleg had to perform public penance as an example, while Ivar's cart was blocked by the crowd. Ivar, fearing exposure, dared not make a sound, yet Leon noticed the tall cart. Mistaking it for a simple hay wagon, Leon gestured to the guards to let the cart pass, and Oleg, engrossed in his penance, did not notice the cart behind him. Despite the tension, they successfully escaped Kiev. Upon returning to Novgorod and seeing Dir, Igor's spirits lifted significantly. With the heir to the throne safe, their only worry was gone. Dir's next plan was to attack Kiev and overthrow Oleg. What Oleg will do next, we shall wait and see.
They run after everything. Even cripples. They will pay the price.
If you're curious about the origin story of Greenland, you definitely shouldn't miss this plotline. Ob, son of Ragnar, returns to Iceland with Kjetil, where the settlers have become self-sufficient. Hospitality is a tradition of the Vikings, so they treated Ob to their best wine and food. Coincidentally, the traveler Other returns at the same time and shares his tales with Ob. Simply put, during a voyage west, he spotted a land of towering mountains and scenic beauty. He assured Ob that this place was a golden, habitable land.
You'll sail with us. You'll try and find this land again.
Not long after, Torvi gives birth to a son, whom Ob names Ragnar in honor of the child's grandfather. Because Torvi's childbirth was not going smoothly, Other prayed for Torvi and her child during the delivery. Ob realized that it was a Christian prayer and Other had to tell the truth. Other was once a Christian missionary. Once, he encountered a Dane who was on the brink of death, and this man was the real Other. In order to survive among these Vikings, he had no choice but to steal Other's identity. Ob didn't care much about who Other really was, but if he was a habitual liar, then the so-called Golden Land might also be a fabrication. For a long period afterward, he was testing Other's integrity while also probing Kjetil, because he believed that Kjetil was involved in Floki's disappearance. Ultimately, Ob chose to believe Other's story, and they set sail with 2 longships to find that land. Torvi had just told their daughter a story about the sea serpent Jormungandr, and that very night, they encountered a fierce storm. To Asa, the storm mirrored the story her mother told, making her feel the terror of Jormungandr. As the sea serpent roared, a huge wave struck their boat. When Torvi opened her eyes again, her daughter Asa had been swept away by the wave. After what felt like an eternity, they finally sighted land, but upon landing, they found its conditions were hardly better than Iceland's. Like they had doubted Floki, the people now questioned Other, asking where were the forests and valleys he promised. Other hadn't lied, but this island was not the place he had seen. However, since they were there, they couldn't give up easily. Kjetil suggested they explore the land and attempt to cultivate it. If it was unclaimed territory, they could declare themselves kings of it. Days passed, and they found no animals or plants. Fortunately, Vikings are a resilient people, accustomed to harsher conditions, so these challenges seemed minor. Ob proposed that the families divide the land equally, each marking their own territory.
What are we going to call this land?
Kjetil suggested naming this barren island Greenland, because it was the start of their dreams, believing that with effort, this desolate island would become the hopeful Greenland. This is the origin story of Greenland. Though the dream was beautiful, the reality was harsh. They found no life and couldn't farm in the short term, so survival became their immediate concern. Ob still aimed to find that golden land, as that was the greatest purpose of his life. A few days later, a beached whale was washed ashore, and everyone marveled, claiming it was a gift from the gods. This was their chance at survival. Coincidentally, the whale beached on Kjetil's territory, who believed it was the will of the gods. According to their laws, what landed on one's land belonged to them, so Kjetil didn't plan to share the whale immediately.
At the moment, legally, the whale belongs to me. If anyone can prove otherwise, let them say so. I'm surprised at you, Kjetil. I thought we were all in this together, no?
The next day, Kjetil still hadn't decided how to distribute the whale. Suffering from hunger, the Vikings didn't care whether Kjetil agreed or not, and their internal conflict began again.
If you stay here, I will decide who stops. Don't you murderer! Butcher himself with the body of our...
To avoid more harm, Ob and Other chose to flee. Eventually, the people escaped Greenland by boat, marking the end of the Greenland storyline. Kjetil successfully became the first king of Greenland, but tragically, he paid a painful price for his ambitions. After Igor's escape, an enraged Oleg declared war on Dir. However, his counselors were not enthusiastic about the war, especially since Oleg was no longer Igor's guardian. There's an understated subplot here involving a general who will play a crucial role in the unfolding events.
I'm the prophet. And I can tell you that our victory is assured. My brother Dir will fall from the balcony of this palace, struck in the chest by an arrow fired by Prince Igor, heir to the throne and my beloved nephew.
A few days later, Dir also advanced towards Kiev with a large army, aiming to preemptively overthrow Oleg. On the way, the general arrived at Dir's camp, where Dir presented him with a large chest of gold and silver treasures. Although they didn't have further exchanges, I assume they must have reached some sort of agreement. When Dir's forces reached the gates of Kiev, the city walls were unexpectedly deserted, casting doubt on the eerie silence. But Dir calmly pushed open the gates, which were unlocked and empty. Ivar warned Dir that this could be a decoy strategy, but instead, a Russ officer emerged from the church, offering his sword in surrender and presenting the city to Dir.
Prince Dir, the army of Kiev salutes you and offers you and Prince Igor our profound love and loyalty from this day forward.
Soon after, the city's soldiers and civilians also emerged, welcoming the rule of Dir and Igor, thus revealing that it wasn't a trap laid by Oleg. It turned out that the general, having been bribed, had turned his back on Oleg, refusing to serve a leader who had lost power, allowing Dir to take Kiev without a fight. Meanwhile, Oleg was still muttering to a painting of Jesus, as if he too were playing the role of a merciful savior at that moment. It's unclear whether he had a genuine revelation or if he had no other choice due to his isolation. Oleg calmly walked onto the balcony and pleaded with Igor for peaceful coexistence.
My brothers, let us all live in peace together. Igor, I love you like a son. And you, Ivar, like a brother.
But who would believe him, aside from children? After all, Oleg had hurt too many people. Ivar handed Igor a bow and arrow, prompting him to end his own nightmare.
If we don't kill him, he will never be free. I love you, you know that.
Ultimately, Oleg's prophecy was fulfilled, but it was not Dir who was shot and fell from the balcony, but Oleg himself.
Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Later, Kattegat told Ivar that she was pregnant with his child. Ivar was speechless and stood frozen, unable to believe he was going to be a father. At Oleg's funeral, Ivar shared the news with Hvitserk. Ivar knew he didn't belong there. He still wanted to return to Katagat. Since Kattegat's home was there, she wouldn't leave with Ivar, but she promised to raise their child well and ensure the child knew of his father's heroic deeds. Kattegat was aware that Ivar's love was for Hvitserk, and she was merely her substitute. The one who was most sad to see Ivar go was Igor. After all, Ivar has been the best friend to him, and Ivar indeed saw himself reflected in Igor. Though Igor was physically able, his guardians had always restrained him, so he often mocked himself as a cripple. Now that Igor was free, Ivar could leave with peace of mind.
Everyone here loves you. I wouldn't go if I didn't think you were safe. You're safe. And you will be king.
Seeing Ivar develop such affection for a boy confirmed to Hvitserk that Ivar had truly changed. He was no longer the cold, merciless tyrant he once was. When they returned to Katagat, the disgusted attitude of everyone towards them could be imagined. Harald wanted to know their purpose for returning. Ivar explained that the Russ were merely a means to reclaim their homeland, and his conflict with Bjorn was just a difference in stance. After all, Harald had personally killed his own brother, so he had no right to judge Ivar. Moreover, as sons of Ragnar, they had every right to claim their place there. Ivar expressed his willingness to support Harald's rule, given that he had no other choice. Hearing that the sons of Ragnar were willing to support him, Harald immediately changed his attitude and publicly spoke well of Ivar and Hvitserk. Although the brothers were deeply hated by the people, Harald's ability to sway public opinion was second to none. After all, his ascension to king was largely due to his eloquence.
Ivar regrets the way he ruled here.
He was young. The responsibility was too great, and he forgot the lessons of his father. He never meant to kill Lagertha. How could he ever mean to kill such a goddess? They have both confessed their sorrows and their mistakes to be judged by their own people.
Although the people had accepted Ivar, he was still restless, living an idle life. He was determined to return to Wessex to challenge Alfred once again. Harold was utterly bored as well. He had spent his entire life pursuing the Norwegian crown, but after achieving his dream, Harold found himself without a purpose. Thus, he decided to accompany Ivar to Wessex. They aimed to bring the flames of war to the last bastion of England.
Is it for this that Ragnar Lothbrok died? Is it for your easy living, your temperate days, that he sacrificed his life? Since his death, the Christian plague has spread across the world, even infecting our Rus brothers. But you still claim to be Vikings. Then act like Vikings. Forget about your comfortable existence. Come with me and conquer King Alfred. Come with me and conquer England and all of its riches. Reclaim your birthright. Be like the gods and reach for Valhalla!
The people who had wanted to punish Ivar days earlier were now swayed into supporters by his rhetoric. So, what direction will this final battle take, and how will the fates of the main characters unfold? The Viking army once again advanced toward England. It wasn't long before the Viking army reached the border of Mercia. Upon learning that the enemy had 200 warships, Alfred decided that retreat was the best strategy. He knew his existing army couldn't defend Winchester, so he led his troops to Chichester to regroup with other forces and left the empty city to the enemy. Elswith could not understand Alfred's seemingly cowardly actions, nor could she tolerate these barbaric Vikings. They kept invading and causing destruction, and even after receiving payments and land, they would return for more. Even if the Vikings were defeated, the merciful king wouldn't execute them but instead allowed them to convert to Christianity. But the Vikings were never truly converted. They invariably reverted to their old ways of invasion and plunder. Elswith was right, and Alfred also realized that these greedy Vikings could never be satiated. But the truth was they were not currently capable of battle. However, the English were not entirely inactive. One day, while Ivar led a hunting party in the wilderness, they killed a deer. But upon closer inspection, they found the deer had been deliberately tied there. When Ivar sensed a trap, a troop suddenly charged out of the woods. After a brief skirmish, Ivar's party was clearly at a disadvantage, as they were just a hunting party and not prepared for battle. Just in the nick of time, Hvitserk arrived with reinforcements. Once Hvitserk's troops merged with Ivar's, the advantage shifted from the English to the Vikings. Then Hvitserk ended the skirmish with a well-thrown axe that killed the enemy commander. Afterwards, the Vikings burned every village they passed through, leaving many villagers homeless and displaced, while King Alfred fled without fighting. Elswith tearfully criticized Alfred's inaction, but Alfred made a classic remark.
It is only important that Ivar does not capture me, for I am Wessex.
However, Ivar hadn't planned to attack Winchester in the first place. He wanted to choose his own battleground, so he picked a place called Edington. This was the perfect battlefield in Ragnar's eyes when he first brought Ivar to England. On the way to Chichester, Bishop Aldulf had already rallied the troops again. At night, Alfred cuts off his peacetime hair, and his flat head signals his determination to fight. Afterward, Alfred delivered an inspiring pre-battle speech. He assured everyone that they would no longer make deals with the devil, nor compromise with these barbarians.
Wessex will never return to the Dark Ages. Wessex will be a beacon for the rest of our country. A beacon of light, a beacon of liberty. We shall never surrender, whatever the cost.
Inside the Viking camp, Ivar and Hvitserk discussed their ideals, but Ivar's eyes turned a deep blue again. Hvitserk remembered from their childhood that every time Ivar's eyes turned blue, there was a risk of fractures. In recent years, the frequency of Ivar's blue eyes had increased, meaning he could fracture at any moment. The English king was also suffering. Alfred fell into another unconscious state. As before, his frail health caused him to faint frequently, and no one knew exactly what was wrong with him or how to treat it. Ivar's legs finally gave out too. That day, he suddenly fractured his right shin while walking, and despite his braces, he still fell to the ground. Nevertheless, Ivar endured the severe pain and managed to get back to his bed. Hvitserk, seeing Ivar's blue eyes, urged him to rest. But Ivar, looking at the spot where he fell, suddenly thought of a strategy. That was to make the enemy crippled as well. How he planned to implement this strategy and how the final battle would unfold, we shall see. To lay claim to a stranded whale, Kjetil drove everyone out of Greenland. However, once at sea, Ub and his party were even less able to survive, as they had neither food nor fresh water. Ub felt deeply guilty, as it was his blind trust in others that led them to such dire straits. Fortunately, fate had not abandoned them completely. They encountered a rainfall, which provided them with enough water to live for a few more days. Still, several days later, they continued to drift at sea. The rainwater they had collected was nearly gone, and everyone lay collapsed on the boat, waiting for a miracle, but misfortune seemed to always be ahead. A boy, unable to endure, drank seawater and died on the small boat the following day. Ub's faith was nearly shattered, and his son Ragnar was also barely holding on. He couldn't understand why the gods were testing him so. He regretted ever leaving Katagat. He didn't want to die here either. Just as Ub was shouting at the sky and questioning the gods, Other mocked him coldly. He mocked that even a son of the renowned Ragnar could lose his faith. Before Other could finish, Ub unleashed his fury on him. Torvi quickly intervened to stop Ub, arguing that if he continued to fight like this, he would be no better than Kjetil.
We tried to murder one another! We are just like Kjetil and those we left behind! Over! For the love of the gods!
Days passed again, and their condition could only be described as hanging by a thread. Ub could only squeeze a bit of water from a rope onto his son's lips. Everyone lay collapsed on the boat, awaiting their fate. After what seemed like an eternity, Ub actually spotted land, which like a shot of adrenaline, revived everyone's spirits. And indeed, it was the fertile golden land they had long dreamed of, finally giving them hope of survival. Ub sincerely apologized to Other, and the two men hugged and wept, grateful that they hadn't given up hope. Just as Other had described, it was a land of beautiful scenery with towering mountains. The cries of seagulls breathed life into them, and the trees in the woods showed them a future. After filling their bellies and resting sufficiently, they began to explore the forests. They had never seen such beauty. Even calling it a paradise would not be an exaggeration. Everywhere was lush vegetation and fruits within easy reach, and the area teemed with all kinds of birds and animals. This place would surely fulfill everyone's dreams of settling down, especially coming from a barren land like the Vikings had. Later, they spotted a deer, and this time they wouldn't have to go hungry. Ub, eating the deer meat, smiled like a child. He hadn't felt this happy in a long time. One day, while hunting, Other found a strange marking, and they realized that there were other peoples living on this continent. To show goodwill, they placed several gifts near the marking. The next day, the gifts had been taken, and in the same place, the other party had left their own gifts. Nad steals a small piece of gold among the gifts when everyone isn't looking, and he'll pay for this greed later on. At night, a piercing laughter echoed through the woods, and Other deduced that it was the sound of the Skraelings. According to historical records, the Skraelings were the natives Vikings encountered when they landed in North America, meaning Ub and his party had indeed set foot on the continent of North America. Ub believed that the exchange of gifts indicated no hostility, so they should follow the tracks to investigate further. Indeed, they found a camp, but it was deserted. Just as everyone was puzzled, a group of Skraelings suddenly surrounded Ub and his party, their bodies painted in red and white. Then a group of women and children followed a man out. Pemanuit broke an arrow to show they meant no harm. Seeing this, Torvi also told everyone to lower their weapons and approached with her son to negotiate with Pemanuit. After introductions, Pemanuit invited them to meet their chief. Although they didn't speak the same language, Torvi guessed Pemanuit's intention. Their chief was a woman named Pakatalit. Pakatalit introduced her family and welcomed Ub and his party. Then Ragnar suddenly began to cry. When Nikani, Pemanuit's wife, moved to comfort him, Ub instinctively rejected her. But when Pakatalit spoke a word of Viking, Ub allowed her to touch his son. The child stopped crying immediately at the sight of something novel, and the other children were also curious and touched others' big beard. The tense atmosphere in the room quickly eased. Ub then invited the Skrins to the camp, where they gave each other gifts and demonstrated their unique weapons and fighting skills.
Yarna!
But these were not the main focus. Ub wanted to know why Pekatolit could speak the Viking language. After several attempts at communication, Pekatolit finally understood what Ub meant, revealing that she had learned the Viking language from a madman. The next day, they took Ub to find this madman. Before they even landed, Ub saw familiar crafts on the trees, all depicting the great stories and gods' totems of the Vikings. What struck Ub most was a depiction of Bjorn bear hunting, the Notre Dame Cathedral, and the Battle of the Seine. Moving on, they see another treehouse, and carved into the pillar is the site of the legendary Viking leader Ragnar being entangled in a viper.
Ragnar.
Seeing this, everyone likely guessed who this madman was, the only person capable of such divine craftsmanship and knowledgeable of these tales. As the treehouse mechanism slowly lifted, a familiar face descended from within the treehouse. Queen Ingrid, wielding a whip, relentlessly lashes at Eric's back. The cause of her fury is King Harold's departure to England, leaving Eric, who not only covets the queen but also plots to usurp the throne. In charge, Ingrid seizes the opportunity to teach Eric a lesson. Unexpectedly for Eric, after indulging her rage, Ingrid invites him to her bed.
Come to bed, my kingmaker.
Poor Harold. Little does he know how many times he has been cuckolded. On this day, Ingrid was up to her usual witchcraft tricks. She gathers a poisonous mushroom, a toxic berry, and some tree bark, grinding them into powder. She then cuts herself on the tongue, beneath her breast, and on her palm. Ingrid mixes her blood with the powder and spreads the concoction on a wooden plank, hammering a nail into it while chanting spells.
I drive it into the eye of Ossothor. Hear my prayer and heed my commands, and bless this stave.
With that, a cursed monolith that would cause a person to go blind was made. She slips the cursed tablet under Eric's pillow, aiming to hex the man who dared to steal the throne. At night, Ingrid nonchalantly tends to Eric's wounds and gifts him a splendid robe, behaving like a happy couple, laughing and talking. But the next morning Eric was literally blind in one eye, no matter how much he cleaned it.
I'm blind.
By afternoon, he is completely blind. Watching him panic and stumble around the room, Ingrid feigns ignorance.
I'm blind. I'm blind.
Days later, Eric, now acting as king, summons the chieftains, falsely claiming Harold's death and demanding their loyalty. To build new fortifications, Eric raises the chieftains' taxes. Who would take a blind man seriously? Seeing Eric fail to command respect, Ingrid tells the chieftains a story. Just a few days ago, a Christian missionary entered a small Danish kingdom and converted the king's faith. Now, that nation has declared itself a Christian state, and despite the people's disagreement, they are set to abolish the worship of the old gods. For the Vikings, this is akin to a catastrophe. To prevent such a catastrophe in Katagat, they must bolster their defenses against all cultural invasions. Ingrid's speech persuades several lords to agree to pay taxes for Katagat's protection. Realizing Ingrid's influential power, Eric understands her ambitions are greater than he imagined. Thus, Eric realizes he has fallen into Ingrid's trap, regretting his involvement with this femme fatale. But now, all Eric can think of is revenge. He bribes a slave, Oleg, with freedom to kill Ingrid. However, Oleg's demeanor and expressions do not inspire confidence in his capabilities. Despite the urgency, Eric, being blind, assigns this crucial task carelessly. Coincidentally, Oleg's girlfriend, Nissa, is Ingrid's maid. Desiring freedom, Oleg shares his task with Nissa, hoping for her help. Eric has one condition: to avoid suspicion, he must not be present when Oleg strikes. Nissa suggests she could visit Eric for intimacy, as it wasn't their first time. Yet on the day of action, Ingrid is prepared. Her guards ambush Oleg, who immediately confesses Eric's involvement. Meanwhile, Nissa keeps to the plan, engaging intimately with Eric in the cabin. Eric slaps Nissa in the face afterwards, but Nissa isn't angry because Eric will soon pay in blood.
I know
I'm here. I myself am here.
Thus, the unworthy king dies in a small cabin, marking the shortest reign in Katagat. Later, Ingrid executes Oleg for treason, revealing that it was Nissa who betrayed both men for her own assent. The scene shifts back to North America. Floki shares his experiences after leaving Iceland. In short, he survived a volcanic eruption, drifted at sea in a small boat, and was eventually rescued by the Skraeling people, who have since taken care of him. One day Nad, the gold thief, snuck into the Skrins camp to see if there was any gold, but after a long search he found nothing. A girl appears, and Nad brandishes a knife to intimidate her, attracting the chieftain's son. Nad is not only reckless but also foolish. In such circumstances, what good can gold possibly do? Even though Nad managed to escape the camp, he was still captured by the Skraeling people, who possess formidable hunting skills. Ub explains to Pekataluk that he was unaware of the situation but will not protect the guilty. They will judge Nad by their own laws. Ultimately, everyone agreed to subject Nad to the Blood Eagle punishment. Upon hearing this, Nad was so terrified that he broke down in tears. Vikings know what that means. However, Other encourages Nad not to fear, as enduring the pain could grant him entry to Valhalla, but as Ub prepares to execute, Nad falters, too frightened to endure.
No.
Ub, seeing this, relents. After all, Valhalla isn't for everyone.
Valhalla is not for you, my friend. Let me put you out of your misery.
This Nad is a disgrace to the Vikings. Afterwards, the Skrins said something meaningful to Torvi.
You understand that when we said you were welcome to this place, we did not mean you were welcome to possess it.
This is the famed Battle of Edington, where Alfred's forces are fully assembled, ready to confront the invading Vikings in a decisive battle. Yet Alfred is unaware of why Ivar chose this particular battlefield. He simply wants to drive these demons out of Wessex, but as his troops enter the fog-enshrouded forest, they have already lost half the battle.
Halt!
Amidst the mist, Harold leads the Viking forces to emerge right in front of them. Cautious Alfred dares not strike rashly. He orders his soldiers to advance in groups. However, the unfortunate vanguard steps into Viking traps. Spikes instantly piercing their lower legs, a tactic Ivar mentioned earlier about crippling the enemy. Strangely, the Vikings retreat. Though Alfred does not understand the enemy's tactics, he cannot let his soldiers languish in pits, so he sends more troops to rescue those caught in traps. But this is exactly what Ivar intended. The soldiers, needing to free their hands to aid others, drop their weapons and shields. At this moment, Vikings hidden underground charge out, turning these unarmed soldiers into easy prey. It's a case of losing more to save one. Ivar's manipulation of the enemy's psyche gives the battle a favorable start. After a feigned retreat, Harold returns to the fight, marking the true beginning of the conflict.
Soldiers, with me!
To better command the battle, Ivar constructs a small suspension bridge in the trees, positioning many archers there. Thus, for the Vikings, the battle is more of a heavily advantaged defensive fight. Alfred, infuriated by Ivar, curses loudly, but Ivar's strategies don't end there. He sends men disguised as English soldiers who infiltrate the rear, kill nuns, and kidnap Queen Elswith. They drag Elswith onto the battlefield to demoralize the English troops and distract Alfred. However, they underestimate Elswith. Amidst the chaos, she seizes a moment to knock down a warrior, then grabs a nailed plank from the ground and smashes the enemy's head, quickly escaping the battlefield. Alfred, left unprotected, finds himself in grave danger as an enemy sword pierces his underarm during the fight. Luckily, the sword didn't hit Alfred's vitals, but if it had been a little more to the right, he would have been dead. As Alfred nearly falls, he thinks he sees a familiar figure covered in blood and crowned with thorns as Lord, reinforcing his belief that God saved him in this critical moment. If the battle continues in this manner, the Saxons are doomed to total defeat. Yet miraculously, the fog in the forest thickens. To avoid any mishaps, Ivar is forced to blow the retreat horn, inadvertently giving the Saxons a chance to breathe. Aldulf and the captain of the knights suggest retreating to strategize. However, no matter what they say, Alfred refuses to retreat. Having witnessed God himself, he fears nothing and would rather die on the battlefield than abandon his lord. Hearing that God appeared, Aldulf also wants to return to see for himself. Meanwhile, Harold, lost in the forest, is wandering when suddenly Aldulf appears behind him and thrusts a long sword through Harold's body. Aldulf intended to see God but ends up fortuitously killing the enemy king, like winning a great prize. Harold, knowing his end is near, mutters about Valhalla, but Aldulf dismissively states that such a place does not exist. Then Harold sees his brother Halfdan, who promises to take him to Valhalla, and Aldulf looked at Harold quizzically, wondering who Harold was talking to. Just then, Harold stabs Aldulf in the neck with a dagger. Many viewers dislike the character of Harold, largely because the series portrays him as lacking integrity. He killed his own brother and usurped Bjorn's kingship. However, historically, Fairhair King Harold was a great monarch who unified all of Norway, and his descendants included many notable kings, such as King Harald Bluetooth and Harald Hardrada. With this, Harold's personal saga concludes. Farewell, Fairhair King. This is the final battle of Viking legends. Before the battle, a Viking cavalryman delivers a white flag, indicating their leader wishes to negotiate peace. Calmly, Ivar walks to the center of the field and throws the chess piece Alfred once gave him, to demonstrate his mercy and to prevent a bloodbath among the Saxons. Ivar proposes a truce and peace talks. However, Alfred throws the chess piece back to Ivar, understanding his nature. As the most fearsome Viking, Ivar's sole desire is to kill and conquer. How could such a man sincerely seek peace? Alfred believes this is merely Ivar's tactic to stall for reinforcements, so he refuses the peace talks, determined to fight the devil to the end despite being at a disadvantage. Seeing this, Ivar wastes no more words. As they have already gained the upper hand in the first half of the battle, Ivar lays down the white chess piece, ready to commence the second half of the fight. Having learned from previous encounters, Alfred will no longer enter the forest. This time, they will face the enemy on an open plain, ensuring a fair fight. As a military strategist, Ivar meticulously plans each battle, rarely engaging in direct combat like Bjorn. However, this time Ivar must face his enemies directly on the plain, but they have prepared a batch of makeshift catapults. Thus, the Vikings hold the advantage in both numbers and equipment.
Our Lord Jesus Christ is with us.
Just after Alfred finishes his prayers, his crucifix is knocked down by a catapult. Although the Vikings seem to have the upper hand, the only and most crucial problem is that Ivar's eyes are becoming bluer by the moment, and he could suffer a full-body bone fracture due to his brittle bone disease at any time. But as the battle intensifies, Ivar sees the crisis unfolding. The battle is not going as he planned. Thinking it would be an easy victory, Ivar is forced to lead the remaining warriors into the fray, but his brittle bone disease strikes after just a few steps. Knowing his time is limited, Ivar still joins the battlefield, enduring the severe pain. The uncertain battle situation, combined with intense pain, causes Ivar to lose his initial confidence. He loudly calls to the gods, seeking some guidance.
What am I supposed to do? Lord, I'm afraid.
Alfred was doing the same thing. The pain from the sword wound in his armpit was unbearable, and he wanted to get direction from the Lord's response. Knowing that Hvitserk is Ragnar's son, the soldiers also understand the strategy of capturing the king to defeat the enemy, so they continuously attack Hvitserk. Seeing his brother in trouble, Ivar keeps moving towards Hvitserk. Even though Hvitserk is brave, he cannot withstand the relentless attacks, and soon, exhausted, he collapses to the ground. Ivar looks at his brother lying before him, remembering how Hvitserk chose him over everything else, since childhood. Besides their mother, only Hvitserk has truly cared for and looked after him. Hvitserk has always been protecting Ivar in his own way. Thinking this, Ivar hastens his steps to Hvitserk's side. He knows Hvitserk has done his best. This war was never theirs to fight. It was a war Ivar started to satisfy his own desire for conquest.
No, brother! You've done your work! Do not interfere anymore. All my life has been in preparation for this moment. I could never kill you. Your eyes are blue, Ira. Not today. I love you. I love you, brother. I love you. I love you. I love you. Now go. 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 Go.
Ivar, on the brink of an attack from his brittle bone disease, was acutely aware that his end was near. He could not last till the end of the battle. To ensure his brother's safety, Ivar pushed Hvitserk out of the battlefield, choosing to face his fate alone, for he had prepared for this moment all his life.
I come over the boneless! Did we eat a Katagat? Did we eat a Kattegat tillbaka dräver mig? Som man kan svaka och blöja till regnet! Att det var
Ivar's roar seemed to awaken the gods, and he was filled with a divine energy as if possessed by a deity. The warriors around him let Ivar command them, their moves synchronized with their leader, as if they would never fall as long as Ivar stood. This also reflected the nature of the war itself. It was Ivar's personal battle, and the soldiers were merely tools to satisfy his desire for conquest.
One day, everyone will know of Ivar the Boneless.
At this point, Ivar's heightened state could be understood as a final surge of vitality. Ivar was well aware that his end was near, so when an unnamed soldier appeared before him, he knew it was time. He chose to confront his destiny, and indeed, the soldier did not hold back. I counted he stabbed him 8 times. In the shortest time, this soldier accomplished the most crucial act. Thus, the once invincible Ivar the Boneless died at the hands of an unnamed soldier, far away in a foreign land. Floki felt the fall of his disciple. For Floki, who had no children, Ivar must surely have been his last concern. Ivar's brittle bone disease finally struck. He fell hard to the ground, and this time, he could not rise again. Seeing this, Hvitserk hurried towards Ivar. Alfred, who was closely monitoring Ivar, immediately called a halt to the battle.
Vikings! Oh my God, six!
Not today.
A battle is
I'm afraid. I'm afraid. I'll never forget.
Thus, Ivar died in the arms of the brother who loved him most. Although everyone saw Ivar as a cold, ruthless, and ferocious man. Let's not forget the environment in which he grew up. He was thrown out into the wilderness by his father on the day he was born, nearly left to be devoured by wolves. Throughout his life, Ivar was surrounded by mockery and cold stares. Yet, not only did Ivar survive in such harsh conditions, but he also developed intelligence and cunning that others could not match. He brought near-apocalyptic disaster to the Saxons. His impact on 9th century Europe even surpassed that of his father, Ragnar. Farewell, Ivar the Boneless. As his brother departed, Hvitserk had no heart for further fighting, and the merciful Alfred accepted Hvitserk's surrender. As part of the surrender, Hvitserk renounced his pagan faith and accepted baptism into Christianity, fulfilling the wish Ragnar had once harbored to join the Christian faith. Alfred gave Hvitserk a new Christian name, Athelstan, and Hvitserk would live under this new identity in East Anglia. When this news reached Katagat, Ingrid naturally became the Queen of Katagat. In the story's final scene, Ub and Floki sat leisurely on the beach, watching the sunset, as serene as elders untroubled by worldly matters. After all, this type of life was the best resolution for the faith Ragnar believed in.
There's so many things that I need to know. You don't need to know anything. It's not important. Let the past go. People love me. Do you remember Ragnar?
Of course I do. Disturbs my nights. He's always hanging around. I can't get rid of him.
Thus concludes the first part of the Viking trilogy, Viking Legends. I wonder if everyone is satisfied with this ending. However, I must tell you a heartbreaking truth. Historically, the real endings of Ragnar's sons were not quite like this.